As we went through the Tanakh, I kept on telling you that the foundation of their faith was Torah, or the law. And you could ask yourself, well, if the New Testament was written by Jews, then what role does law play within the New Testament? And it's interesting that when you look at a lot of Christian writings, both at the time of the early church and later, we see that there was a group who wanted to do away with all the laws. Do away with the laws, and now we can live under Jesus. Jesus is the only law. There is no more worried about Torah. And in fact, there were many people who believed that. In fact, a lot of Christians believed that as well, that now the Jewish law no longer applied. Some people even interpret Paul, that Paul was advocating that, particularly in letters like the letter to the Galatians, where he was saying, we don't need to worry about the law anymore because now the law is consumed within Jesus. I think that all of those are misinterpretations of what happened within, or what Jesus was offering. Because Jesus never said that he's come to do away with the law. Rather, what Jesus says is that he is the fulfillment of the law. Now, what does it mean for him to be the fulfillment? I'm not sure that in fact it means that somehow we can now just follow Jesus and therefore the law now no longer applies. In fact, what I'd rather want to say is that when Jesus sees himself as fulfillment, it's connected to, for example, when he raised up the cup at the Last Supper saying, this is the new covenant sealed by my blood. You may remember when we did covenants that I was saying that that concept of covenant is connected to Jeremiah 31, where the law will now be written on our hearts. And so in a sense, what Jesus accomplishes is he actually accomplishes the sealing of that covenant, where now we will have the law written on our hearts. The importance of Pentecost, of the Holy Spirit coming and being with us, of giving us the law on our hearts. So the law doesn't disappear. In fact, the difference now is that the law, instead of being an outward written concept, becomes now an inward relationship with God. That the law originates not from outside of us, but from within us. And I think that's what Paul was trying to say as well, when he was talking to the Galatians by saying that they no longer needed to become Jews first in order to be Christians. Because circumcision, which again is an outward sign of connection to God, was no longer the issue. Because now through the Holy Spirit and through Pentecost, it's now able to be circumcision of the heart. That we're able to have an inward sign that we are now part of God's people. That we are now part of the chosen people of God through that. So law continues to be the foundation stone. The difference is the accessibility to that law is now no longer just within the written Torah, but now within the lived experience of relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And we see that particularly in the way in which Jesus sums up the law. He gets called by some lawyers saying, what is the most important law? Now, for us, when we think about that, we automatically respond because we've got the New Testament, we've got the Gospels, and so we can quickly parrot what Jesus said. But when Jesus was asked that question, there was no New Testament, there was no response to that. What there was the 613 commands of the Torah. And of course, the rabbis had been debating for a long time which of those 613 are the most important. Of course, Jesus responds by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And essentially what he says is these two commands are not two commands at all, but really two sides of the same command. And so we can see that over and over, Jesus uses Torah to back up what he's saying. When we look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7, we see the same thing, is that Matthew 5-7 is filled with reflections backwards into Torah and then forwards into this new dispensation, this new covenant of the law written on our hearts. That in fact, once the law is written on our hearts, then the impetus, the reason for us to obey is not the fear of punishment, is not even the promise of reward. But the reason why we obey is because we have a living, real, inward relationship with the God who gives us his law. So when we interpret law in the New Testament, let's always understand that the law in the New Testament is directly connected to Torah. That the Jews never gave up Torah, and we as Christians shouldn't do that either. Too often, though, what we do as Christians is we become part of that group called the Marcionites, the people who cut off the Old Testament and say that's no longer relevant to us. All what we need is from the New Testament. All we need is the words of Jesus. But when we forget that the words of Jesus sit on top of that which has gone before in God's revelation through the Tanakh, we actually miss the point. We miss the understanding of what those laws were for, what they were trying to accomplish. And so often what can happen then in Christianity, and has happened in Christianity, is that Christianity becomes also a religion of rules. It goes back to Moses' covenant and misses out completely on the fact that Jesus is the sealing of the new covenant, the Jeremiah covenant, the covenant that actually puts that law and writes it on our hearts, that writes it in the words of relationship rather than in the words of punishment or reward.